let me say again, for those of you who have just logged on, welcome. We're delighted to have you join us tonight. I'm Nathan Bierma. I'm president of Sabre Southern Michigan, and really excited to feature tonight these, let me stop the video. Really excited to feature these historians that we've assembled to talk about the House of David baseball team of Benton Harbor. Let me introduce them briefly, and then I'll ask them each an introductory question. So Don Gittersanke wrote this book called Baseball's Bearded Boys back in the 1990s. It was self-published, it was out of print, and we've recently reprinted it through a website I run called tigershistory.com. I logged on just before this and realized that the link to buy it is broken. So I'm going to have you email me if you want a copy. You can buy the PDF or you can buy this paperback copy. But this is the first, at the time, the first book-length study of the House of David, and it's based of the team. And it's based on Don's extensive research and some of his personal experience and interviews with the team, which we're going to ask him about in just a second. Chris Siriano is online. He is the director, the founder, and the director of the House of David Museum. And he wrote a book of his own on the House of David with a chapter on the team. And we're also really delighted to welcome Phil Dixon. If you've encountered Negro Leagues history at all, you know Phil. He is this prolific researcher and author and speaker. He's one of the main people. He was very instrumental in the when the commissioner announced late last year that the Negro Leagues would be granted major league status. Phil was credited, and rightly so, as one of the people whose work had brought Negro Leagues history to this point. And Phil's going to tell us about the intersections between the House of David and the Negro Leagues, which were extensive and fascinating, and those stories really intertwine. So we're delighted to get all those different angles of the story tonight. So let me start by asking each of you about your connection to this story. How did you get involved or interested in the House of David? When or where did you first encounter it? And what made you want to research it? And Don, as you write in your book, I know that your answer to this question begins with your father, right?
Exactly. Yeah, my father was born and raised on a farm in the Bridgman, St. Joseph area. And he played baseball with the House of David home team. He practiced with them and played a few games whenever they needed an extra player. And he was a third baseman. So he got me interested in the House of David.
And tell us more about exactly his background with the team. Because he wasn't a member of the community, right? So did he sort of moonlight for the team, and what were his memories of that experience?
Yeah, well, you know, I never got to talk to him too much about the real interaction with the team. He died rather early. And after he died is when I started researching and trying to find out more about the team and his playing on the team. And I could find very little about it. So what he did mention to me was that he was a third baseman. He said now and then the team would, somebody would get hurt or somebody wouldn't be playing and they'd pull him up. But he said he practiced with the team, and that's about all I know. I did find one picture recently that I think is him. Nobody's been able to identify it, so I'm not sure if that's him or not.
Chris, over to you. How did you first encounter this story, and how did you become literally the curator of this history?
I graduated from college with a major in history, and I came home and wanted to learn about local history. And everything that I read, and it seemed like everything that touched local history had to do with the House of David. And I made a decision early on that since nobody was doing anything to save this amazing story, that I wanted to do it myself. And so thank God at the time, there were a pretty good handful of House of David members alive. Today, there are none. But back then, which was about 30 years ago, there were a good handful of members alive, and they were willing to tell their story. And I was lucky enough to befriend Lloyd Gallagher, who was the last living member of the original House of David team, played from 26 to 40. And he took me on kind of as a adopted grandson, and just fascinated me, his stories, and he was so willing to share all those. And it wasn't long before I acquired a pretty gigantic collection of House of David and decided to open a museum with the blessings of the House of David members. And then I met Don Gitterzonke and was lucky enough to buy a huge collection of baseball artifacts from Don, which were super rare. And I held the first House of David baseball reunion in 1997. And then we had a second reunion in 1999 with about 14 players. Within a few years, they were all gone. But it's just a story that's fascinated my mind in so many ways. And now, it's 25 years later. I have tens of thousands of pieces of their artifacts and their history. And I've written a couple books and made a documentary. It's in the process of making a second documentary right now. It's an amazing piece of American history that I really, really feel strongly that everybody should know about.
You mentioned that you had this awareness, or that this came from local history, your awareness of local history, and this story is so embedded in local history. I'm curious, what do you think? How well? My view is that this story isn't that well known, even here in Michigan, in southern Michigan. Is this story still known and lifted up and celebrated in the Benton Harbor, St. Joseph area? How widely and how widely known and how well held is it in sort of the community awareness?
That's a great question. It's absolutely the biggest piece of history that most of Michigan holds, even though, like you said, it's a big unknown to so many people as well. And, they had a big giant pre-Disneyland type amusement park that started in 1908, and it attracted over 75 million people during its time. And a lot of those folks are gone. And, they played baseball from 1914 to 1954. And so during that 40-year span, they touched millions, tens of millions of lives, but a lot of those folks are gone. So, it's the generation that's alive now. Some care about history and want to learn more. And some, it's just something that's just fascinating that they never heard about before. But, I kind of made it a mission to try to keep the word out there. And the baseball part is the absolute biggest part. There's baseball historians from around the globe that come because of the oddity of the House of David. And it's such a rare piece of baseball history that's the biggest part of the story that remains alive and well.
Phil Dixon, over to you. Tell us about how you first encountered this story and how it has, how you've seen it been intertwined with the story of the Negro Leagues and many Negro Leaguers.
Well, I guess I have been pecking around this House of David thing. Believe it or not, I started back in 1981, so this is my 40th year. You can imagine that. At that time, I met a guy by the name of Maurice Doolittle Young. And Doolittle Young had played on the 1927 Kansas City Monarchs. He played for a season, and then he left the Monarchs, and he kind of piled around with several teams, and he ended up on the colored House of David. So we were looking through some photographs, and he said, I tried to get on the White House of David, and he had photographs, of the House of David, and he began to tell me about the history and how he had taken a blood test and to prove that he was so much percent Native American, Choctaw Indian, to try to get on the White House of David, which he never got on. But that was the introduction, basically. And then I sold insurance. I'm still in the insurance business, and there was a young lady on my insurance route. I was what they called a debit insurance man back then, when you went to the house and you picked up the premium. And she was from Benton Harbor. And so she began to tell me a lot of things about Benton Harbor inside that I wouldn't have ever known. And then the other one was, there was a guy by the name of Dorsey Mulder who lived in Kansas City, and he had played for the House of David. And he played during the time that Smith there, Oil Smith, was the catcher in Grover Cleveland. And he began to tell me stories also. Dorsey Mulder had signed a contract with the American Association in 1929, he began to tell me about other players and share his pictures. And then finally in 1992, when I released my book, the Negro Baseball Leagues of Photographic History, I included a whole section of photographs on the House of David. And ever since then, I've always tried to learn more. And I pick it up really strong in 1931 when Grover Cleveland and Alexander joins the team.
So I want to ask each of you this, starting with Don. At the core of this is this, of course, religious colony, this relatively cloistered religious community that has this, that develops this baseball team that exceeds and becomes nationally, internationally known. Don, why did this religious community play baseball, and why and how did they play it just about as well as anyone of their era?
Well, Ben Purnell, the founder, was interested in sports and in keeping the people occupied since they were celibate. He wanted to give them something to do. But also, he was interested in health and wanted the people to stay healthy. So he suggested the idea of a baseball team, and that's how they started. How they got so good is beyond me. I don't know. Maybe Chris can elaborate on that. But I know they did put in practice after practice after practice, and you know, like they say, practice makes perfect. So I guess it was just putting in all the practice.
Chris, should we be surprised that such a religious community produced a team and produced such a good team?
It's baffling how they were so great. Like Don said, you know, in 1914, Benjamin decided they had a whole lot of teenage boys with a whole lot of pin-up energy. You know, they couldn't be with the opposite sex at all on any level. And they needed something to do to pass their time. And he loved baseball. And just a few years before that, the Talley family had arrived from Arkansas, who had 4 phenomenal athletes, brothers, and really great baseball players. And there were some great baseball players that had arrived from Australia, believe it or not. And he put a team together. By 1915, they won the Michigan State Championship. And by 1917, they were featured in the Spalding Baseball Digest, you know, which is kind of like the Bible of baseball. And, you know, I've got stories, feature front page articles from 1919, 1920, 21, and all the way through the 40s, front page stories about these weird looking white guys with long hair and whiskers that are taking over the barnstorming world in baseball. So, you know, they like Don said, they took it on like as a religion. That's what they wanted to do, is be the greatest that there was, and they ended up being pretty darn good.
Could some of these players that you interviewed, George Anderson, was it Tom DeWurst, could they have been major leaguers or high achieving minor leaguers, Don or Chris?
Absolutely, absolutely. They many of them were major league caliber players, and several of them were offered huge contracts to come play in Major League Baseball, but they wouldn't leave the House of David. They wouldn't, you know, part of the deal was that they had to be clean shaven, and they thought that the man had to be in the likeness of Jesus, and they could never shave. So that they weren't going to shave their whiskers to make some money. They thought their whiskers were getting them to heaven, and they wanted to have their long hair and beards, and they didn't care. So they didn't leave to play in the majors. But
I wonder if they'd get in today with their beards and long hair.
Right.
Look at Jason Worth or someone like that, right?
Right.
They'd fit right in.
Actually, Nathan, Cookie Hannaford, Dave Harrison, John Tucker, and Dutch Faust were offered contracts to play Major League Ball, and they all turned them down.
Right.
Because of the reasons that Chris said.
Phil, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's seems to be a sort of affinity between Negro League teams and this team. They both had this sense of baseball as theater, of performance, as this traveling show. And they both had a sense, it seems, of what it meant to be marginalized. Now, you could say the House of David marginalized themselves by willingly submitting to all these religious strict codes, whereas for Negro Leaguers, it was a very different story. But was there a sort of affinity between Negro League teams or Negro League players and this House of David team, with whom and against whom they often played?
Oh, no doubt about it. The interesting thing was when a black team played the House of David, they usually drew well. For instance, in the 1930s, when Ray L. Doan was promoting the team, he worked in conjunction with Tom Baird and then also J.L. Wilkinson. And a lot of times what they would do is the House of David would go to a town, maybe they're playing in Racine, right? And they beat the local team pretty good. And then the Monarchs would come through. They played the local team, beat them pretty good. And so guess what? They're going to book the House of David and the Monarchs back into that same town and take all the money. And it was something they did quite a bit. So the Monarchs and House of David played a lot of the same towns, especially in the Midwest, up through Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. So yeah, there was a great relationship. And I think the relationship got stronger after 1931, I'm pretty sure. And funny thing, in 1931, House of David was rolling along. They had Grover Cleveland, and they also had the Kansas City Monarchs lights. So they had this night show. They even had a guy who had his arms were amputated, and he traveled with them. I think his name was McKeon or something like that. He traveled with them as part of their show, and he would show people how they could shave and catch and things like that without arms. So they had this guy, and they had Grover Cleveland, of course. They had the night baseball. Man, they were like one of the most popular road shows around. And in some ways, I even think in 1931, House of David saved baseball because of the lights. And they certainly drew enough attendance to rival any major league team in 1931. So there's some great history out there that's not being told about the House of David and the wonderful relationship. I might also mention in 1931, they were rolling along really strong, beating teams really well. And they went against the Homestead Grays. They also played Hilldale in Pennsylvania. They played the Baltimore Black Sox. They played Joe Green, Chicago Giants. They played the Kansas City Monarchs and the St. Louis Stars. And a total of 12 games, and the House of David only won one of them. So the next year, they're going to come back a little stronger and just gets kind of better. And probably I will mention 1932, the House of David beat the Homestead Grays in York, Pennsylvania. That was one of their big victories early on. And then, of course, the rest is history. They keep playing against black teams probably until the end of their legacy.
And another big win around that time, they also played white major league teams on occasion. And they beat the St. Louis Cardinals in Sportsman's Park. I don't know if Dizzy or Daffy Dean were pitching that day, but that was quite a feather in their cap. That was, I think, that year, right around then, right?
Well, in my book, I think it was George Anderson mentioned that they played the St. Louis team at Sportsman's Park. And he mentioned that both Daffy and Dizzy were playing. However, Daffy didn't even start playing until 34, so he was a few years off. He also mentioned the next year they won the World Series, which they didn't. It took a couple years later for them to win it, but they did play them, they did win, and they were good. Following up with Phil's comment, there were a couple other things. The Monarchs and the House of David shared their lighting system. So that was one thing that brought them together. And the other thing, the House of David also had a pitcher by the name of, oh gosh, what was his name? You know who I mean, Phil?
Was it the House of David? You talking about Satchel Paige?
Yes. Yeah, they had Satchel pitching for him for a while too. So that brought in some crowds too.
So he would sometimes pitch for the House of David.
Or
and
the
at other
House of
times-
David, right,
And at other times he would pitch for the Monarchs against them.
right. And
You know, just-
from the
go ahead.
statistics I could find, the House of David won about 75 or more % of their games. Against the Negro League teams, they won about 50% of their games. So the Negro League teams were very good. And of course, they had a lot of future Hall of Famers.
Right, absolutely. Phil, let me go back real quick to you. You and Don both mentioned the lights, and if I understand right, to give credit where it's due, it was the Monarchs who developed this innovative lighting system, and then the House of David used it and I guess helped popularize it. Was it that innovation in particular that led you to say just now that helped save baseball during the Depression in the early 30s?
Well,
Or what
absolutely.
was- yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also-
Because the Monarchs kicked off night baseball in 1930, and it changed the game completely. Also, the amount of people who came to see the games now, everybody was curious about this new technology. The movies had only started talking in 1926 with Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. So everybody's pretty excited to see these lights. And so the Monarchs made a fortune in 1930. Now, what's interesting is Ray Eldon comes to the Monarchs in December of that year, somehow cuts a deal with J.L. Wilkerson and Tom Baird to use the Monarchs lights the entire season. And so the Monarchs don't even start in 1931 until July the 4th. And then when they do start, they're going to go over the same territory that House of David had gone through, but they're playing twilight games. And so, Ray Eldon is probably someone that when you talk about the House of David history, Ray Eldon, a great promoter out of Muscatine, Iowa, doesn't get enough publicity. He was one behind the Dizzy and Daffy Dean barnstorming tour. He was also behind Satchel Paige getting to the House of David in the Denver Post tournament, but not enough is presented on him. Very fascinating fella. And of course, he added a thing called donkey baseball. He was the inventor of donkey baseball, which the House of David also played a little bit. I've seen pictures of Grover Cleveland riding a donkey. So that's all Ray Eldon, and just a brilliant promoter, doesn't get any recognition. And he was the driving force behind the House of David when in the area that I say that they were saving baseball, because they didn't just play small towns like what Ken Burns was talking about. They take their light show to Chicago because Major League parks didn't have night baseball either.
Right, and that came in the mid 30s, was it? First in Cincinnati, night games in the majors, after seeing the success that the Monarchs and others had had with it.
Well, you might find this interesting. In 1931, the Cincinnati Reds wanted to play the House of David in a night game at Crossley Field. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis said that the House of David team that Grover Cleveland had too many outlaw players on it. These are guys that had signed major league contracts with their, or some minor league, and they're playing with the House of David. So he didn't allow House of David to play, but he did have Grover Cleveland play with some semi-pro team out of Kentucky, and they did play under those lights in Crossley Field, 1931.
Wow. Don and Chris, let me ask you about your experience interviewing some of these players in the 80s and 90s. So Don, your book was published in 96, and you have some photos of some of these players shortly before the book was published, including, is it Tom DeWurst, who was called the Bearded Babe Ruth? He died shortly before your book was published. Tell me about, how did you meet these guys, and what was your experience of their memories and their stories about being playing on these teams?
Well, I met some of them through Chris. He had mentioned some of these people and where they were and how to approach them and that sort of thing. So George Anderson, I went to his home and interviewed him. Lloyd Gallagher, I went to the House of David to Shiloh and interviewed him there at his residence at the House of David. Tom Dewhurst, he was living out by the lake in a house that was off the road. And Earl Boyer Smith, I interviewed him at his house.
And what was your, how clearly and how vividly were some of these memories still alive for them? What was it like as they were talking and remembering and reminiscing about these years?
Well, I was just fascinated. I had all I could do to write down and record what they were saying because I was just fascinated with everything they were saying. It was just a thrill. And particularly George Anderson, he was involved with both the city and the house. And he had a fire in his house and he lost everything in his house except his garage. And he had some uniforms out there, basketball uniforms. And he gave me one. And boy, I'll tell you, I treasured that all the way back to Las Vegas on the plane. I held it in my lap. They were a gold satin and they had the flap on the back like the Navy uniforms, and they were trimmed in red, white, and blue. And Chris has that now in his collection. So it was just fascinating. Tom Dewhurst, he was very accommodating, and he showed me a bat that was given to him. They called it the silver bat. It was a aluminum bat. And Lloyd Gallagher showed me a baseball that he treasured. And it was just absolutely fascinating to talk to these players. And I might mention also, Phil mentioned donkey baseball. As a kid, I was honored to attend a donkey baseball game that the House of David put on.
What'd you think? It sounds interesting.
Well, it's kind of crazy because, you know, they can't get the donkeys to move. So, I mean, they're hitting them, they're pushing them. It's not a game you want to be over in a couple minutes because it's not going to be. It's going to take hours. But it's funny. I mean, it's entertaining. And that was the purpose of it.
Chris, let me ask you the same question. Some of your experiences talking with and spending time with and getting to know some of the former players. What stands out to you? What was that experience like?
Oh, man, it was an amazing experience. You know, I had the pleasure of really becoming great friends with Lloyd Gallagher, who was a genius about their baseball history. And like I said, he played 26 to 40, but then with the help of Howard Crossman, who was administrator at the House of David, and when things were still going there, we were lucky enough to locate over a dozen other players, and we got them together at my museum. And it's the first time they'd seen each other in like 60 plus years. And they all not only recognized each other, but they hugged on each other and laughed. And we had a huge round the room discussion with a bunch of lounge chairs. They carried on and told story after story of the most amazing, hilarious times that they, and that was like yesterday to them. You know, they said it was the best times of their lives. And, you know, I got a lot of that on film and learned a lot. I was lucky enough to have filmed interviews of Lloyd and Ike Bone, who's a serious comedian that played big time ball back then with the House of David. And, you know, I think the thing that I learned the most out of all those guys was that baseball was everything to them. They just wanted to get out and play ball. They lived for baseball. It was huge. You know, they had belly laughs when they talked about it like a little kid. It was an amazing time in life that I was able to find them all, get them here. Got Eddie Deal here from California, who was a superstar catcher for them. You know, they recalled many times of playing with the Negro League teams and some of the great stories of traveling with the black teams when America was, you know, they were pretty prejudiced back then, a lot of towns, and they would bring these superstar players in on another bus, and just the stories are just baffling to me.
Well, let's land on that point for a second. I mean, so it was groundbreaking for the House of David to appear to have African-American players on their roster or in their lineup, or to play African-American teams. And they did come in, they did have instances, did they not, where a town would attempt to or want to reject black players or black teams, and the House of David ended up having to kind of draw a line in the sand. Don, you're nodding, and we want to hear from Phil as well, but go ahead, Don.
Well, what I had heard was they would travel in 2 touring cars, and one touring car would go into town ahead of the other car. And it would be like just before a game time, and like a day or so before maybe, or early that day. And they would go to the promoters in the town and they would say, we want to play against the Monarchs, let's say. And the town people would say, oh, I don't know, it's a black team. I don't know if we want to. They'd say, well, that's what we're going to do. The black team's going to play and then we're going to play. And if you don't like it, we can move on because we're booked with the next town. And so I guess they created some real furors doing that. But the end result was the Monarchs played and they played. And the promoters would say, well, if we do it, we're never having you back again. Well, after they saw both teams play the next year, they had them back again. So there was that relationship, which was really neat.
Phil, how often did the House of David find itself in a situation like that, where they were up against that barrier or saw the barrier that the Monarchs or others were up against and applied pressure against it?
I didn't really run into any stories like that. I know that the House of David had a little more freedom than the Monarchs did. For instance, when it came time to stay at a hotel, a lot of times the hotels that the House of David were allowed to stay at, the Monarchs couldn't stay there. So many times I remember talking to Dorsey Moulder, and he said the funny thing was to him, he said they would get in town, they would never see the Monarchs till game time. And then they showed up at the park. They didn't know where they went, because they, a lot of times they just didn't know where they were, but they weren't in the same hotels, that's for sure. But one thing I noticed with Ray O'Donnell and J.L. Wilkerson and Tom Baird, these were master promoters, and they would lay out that season. And so they pretty much knew where they were going to go. And generally, maybe sometimes weeks before, I've seen publicity where, they said, we got the House of David this summer, Kansas City Monarchs this summer, and they're talking about that. And they're talking about that in March, and the team doesn't appear there till July. So, but one thing that is really important, I think, to mention is that after 1931, the Monarchs in 1930 went east and they traveled through the east, but they didn't go past Pittsburgh. And then they certainly didn't go out to like the Pacific Coast or anything like that. But the House of David's success in 1931, using the Kansas City Monarchs lights, which was those words are in a lot of publicity that these lights belong to the Kansas City Monarchs, allowed the Monarchs to enlarge their territory in 1932, 33, 34. And so the House of David actually helped the Kansas City Monarchs in ways that probably haven't been mentioned.
Interesting. You mentioned the 31 season as sort of a watershed, and the arrival of Grover Cleveland Alexander as being instrumental in that. Don, let me start with you. How and why did this future Hall of Famer and very accomplished major leaguer come to be the player manager of the House of David team?
I don't know if I can answer that, Nathan. Maybe Chris can, but I really don't know.
Chris, can you help us, or Phil?
Yeah. Yep. He had helped Cardinals win the World Series in 26. And after that, for many years, he was considered the greatest pitcher of all time. But he liked to drink, and alcohol was not his friend. And so he was kind of lost his major league job. And the House of David saw the talent in Grover Cleveland and offered him a lot of money to play for them, and actually had to pay his wife the same salary to keep him sober at least through the 4th inning. They had to guarantee that Grover Cleveland would show up and pitch for 4 innings. And Lloyd Gallagher, who was on that team with Grover Cleveland, said, Chris, the alcohol stench in the dugout was rough. And his wife was allowed to sit down next to me, and we'd try to keep Grover Cleveland from hitting the bottle. And he said the guy could throw strikes even when he was intoxicated, and they let him wear his house slippers on the pitcher's mound so he could feel exactly where the mound was underneath his toes. And he would throw strikes, even though maybe he couldn't see straight, but he was a definite phenom. And Ray Doan, the guy that Phil's been talking about, he opened up a House of David pitching school in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and with Grover Cleveland teaching not only House of David players how to pitch, but anybody that wanted to learn how to pitch, he was there for them. And it's a cool chapter in early baseball for the House of David. I've got a ton of stuff on his life, and I actually met a neighbor kid that had grown up and his grandpa next to Grover Cleveland, and he said he learned to pitch throwing the baseball against a barn, and his grandpa would get mad because he'd be out there in the dark throwing strikes on like a bullseye on the side of the barn. So the guy was a phenomenal pitcher, and sadly, like the way of a lot of success stories, he ended up working in a circus act, telling his story at the end of his days. But I've got all that in the museum. It's just fascinating stuff.
And I just read a reference, maybe it was in Don's book, to a movie about Grover Cleveland Alexander that includes a portrayal of him in Benton Harbor with the team. And Grover is played by none other than aspiring actor Ronald Reagan. So I forget the name of the movie, but I added that to my to watch list. Ronald Reagan playing Grover Cleveland Alexander in Benton Harbor.
That's right.
The name of the movie is The Winning Team.
Right.
The Winning Team. Okay.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So go ahead, Phil.
The only thing I was going to add to Chris's story, in 1930, Grover Cleveland was offered a job, I think, with Columbus, if I'm correct. And this is after he had been pretty much kicked out of the Texas League for breaking training. And so he came to Chicago and locked himself into a hotel room, and he had a nurse that would come out, and no one could get to him. So they finally cut him from the American Association Columbus team before he ever put on the uniform. And Ray L. Doan contacted him and say, hey, look, we'd like to have you pitch, I think it was like 4 games for the House of David in 1930. And, I can't remember if he ever did that. I don't remember finding those games, but that was the first pitch that he gave to try to sign Alexander, because Alexander's marquee value, he wasn't a great pitcher when he joined the team, and he had to pitch almost every night, at least 1 inning. People felt like they got short-changed. They left the park disappointed if they couldn't see him pitch at least 1 inning. And so the stress was really on Alexander, but he kind of pulled through. And in the end, he really became a part of the team. At first, it was kind of rough. He would go long stretches where he didn't pitch. The other guys would have to carry the burden, but he really became a part of the team and a part of the legacy. And it's hard to talk about House of David now without mentioning Grover Cleveland Alexander.
Right.
So help me understand this, because as you're describing him and his battles with alcohol and how he became no longer welcome in the major leagues, you wouldn't hear that story and think, I bet he's going to land in a strict religious commune in a team and play for them. So and this is part of a more serious question I have too, because Don, in your book you talk about how they in this era the team gets more ringers, more players to come join the team. How exactly did the team shift from when it started? It was, you're a member of this community, you're all in, you're observing all these everything you have to observe, to it seems like there's a shift here where now it's like, well, we can put this guy's name on the marquee, he has marquee value. Was there a shift? How did that work?
Well, remember what I said, they were a celibate celibate group. So as they got older, you didn't have any young players coming up. So they didn't have their own farm team. So when the players got too old to play, what did they do? They had to go out and recruit.
Right.
And they didn't make them say, you know, they didn't have to sign into all the religious practices. They just had to play, right?
Right. They had contracts.
Yep. Yep.
All right, let me ask you another thing. I think that's part of this story. We saw it in the Ken Burns clip, and that is the game of pepper. There used to be a sign, I think, at Tiger Stadium, I think up until the very end, you know, no pepper games. And the House of David claimed to invent, or authors have claimed on its behalf that this team invented pepper, or at least popularized it. We saw in the clip, you know, the catching the ball around the back, and they would sometimes roll the ball, you know, around and do tricks. Tell us about how this developed, why it was significant, and why it appealed to crowds. Don, do you want to speak to that?
Well, they were entertainers, and you know, and they would throw the ball around, and they practiced it, and then it would end up that the ball disappeared, and somebody'd say, "Where's the ball?" And they'd pick up a beard, and it would be under somebody's beard. So then the crowd would roar, and that became a major attraction for them, that particular thing. And they invented it. They also invented the pop-up slide and some other things. They would practice it, and it became known that they were doing this, and that became part of their routine.
Once again, I'm struck by the commonalities when we think about the House of David and we think about the Negro Leagues. That sense of showmanship, that sense of putting on a show, the sense of baseball as performance, baseball as theater, was integral to that experience. And at the same time, with both these teams, they could play serious baseball, no frills, no antics. Don't let the gimmicks distract you. They could play serious baseball all day long and with anyone. Phil, do you see that as a tension or a contradiction? Was that just sort of embraced as the full picture, the full part of the Negro Leagues experience, and to some extent the House of David experience?
Well, I think the best stories haven't been told about the Negro League experience and the House of David experience. That's why, you know, as I talk about J.L. Wilkinson and the Monarchs territory being enlarged because of the House of David and Rail Dome, those are stories that aren't being told. But, you know, when they traveled together, one thing I thought was kind of unique, the House of David would come out, you know, in various innings, you know, fifth, sixth, something inning like that, and do their pepper game. But before the game, the Monarchs and black teams would come out and do their shadow ball. So when those two teams got together, not only was the baseball good, but the entertainment was even more fantastic. So
right.
This is a great legacy that we're discussing tonight. And I'm just happy to be a part of the conversation because I think it's a conversation that needs to be had and needs to be continued.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
As I see so many of you logged on, and we're delighted to have a great audience with us live here. Let me say, if you have questions for our panel, questions about the team, questions for any individual panelist or any or all of them, go ahead and either put it into the chat window or just raise your hand if your video is on, and I can see you and recognize you, and you can ask your question. We can have our panel speak to it, and we'd love to hear from you. I'm also interested how well you knew this story before you logged on tonight, and something maybe you've heard or learned tonight that is stuck with you. As we wait for questions to come in, Chris, let me have you show off your backdrop a little. You're at the House of David Museum, and I see the train in the background. The mini trains were a staple of the amusement park there. What can our audience look forward to if they come to visit you at the museum?
Yeah, there's thousands of items from the amusement park train, simulation of it, many baseball pieces, posters, broadsides, hundreds of photos, lots of baseball uniforms, lots of Negro League pieces. We've got stories about when the House of David team traveled across America. I don't know if you can see those pictures there. They have captions underneath them. That was from Lloyd's collection in his room that he shared with me. Let me make copies of it. There's lots of stuff. I helped the Boston Globe write a story about how the House of David influenced the Boston Braves when they won the World Series because of their whiskers. Pictures of Babe Ruth and House of David guy pulling his beard, a letter stating how much if Babe showed up to play a game would the team would get, and how much if he didn't play. There's a piece about Ray Doan's baseball school, lots of posters, uniforms, donkey baseball. There's a white House of David versus black House of David broadside. There's just room after room of lots of things, stories, posters. We've got film footage of Grover Cleveland Alexander playing in the Pepper game, even though he was hilarious and very awkward. It was funny that he tried to play that. He wasn't any good. Here's a whole pile of posters that we got in that are Negro League related posters from back in the day. I haven't sorted through them yet, but there's about 100 of them that I acquired.
Chris, as you're panning around, can I ask you real quick, because Mitch asked in the chat, is there a link for the museum? And I brought up your Facebook page. I can put that in the chat here. What's the museum is by appointment only, and it was even before the pandemic. That's just how you do it. What's the best way for someone to make such an appointment? Is it by email or?
Yeah, it's either the House of David Baseball Museum on Facebook. You can request an appointment through there. You can call or text at 269-325-0039. Or you can email houseofdavid9@aol.com. Any of those, and we will definitely get with you to get you in for a tour. There's a cool broadside. I don't know if I'm showing it right, but Van Dyke's colored House of David. And Phil was telling me that one of these guys had been released from Alcatraz and came and played. Is that right, Phil?
Well, that was Pitts. Pitts was the guy. But the guy who was the owner of the team was, what's his name? Harry Crump. He owned a hotel in Twin Cities, a black hotel. So recognize some of those guys. And there's a famous, his name is Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks played for the Colored House of David basketball team.
Okay. Yep. We have a little bit about the House of David basketball team and the white one and the colored team. Van Dyke's had a colored House of David team, right?
Right. You know, can I mention one thing on the Van Dykes? When I talked to Doolittle Young, he said that some of the black guys had problems growing beards. So they decided that they could grow a Van Dyke, which is, kind of like what Sir Walter Raleigh was wearing. And so they growing Van Dykes and changed the name from House of David to the colored Van Dykes.
Very cool.
So let me ask, because we did have a question come up in the chat. Gary asks, how was the Black House of David team related to the House of David? Were they licensed? Did they pay the House of David for use of the name? Were they affiliated? What exactly was the relationship there?
Well, you see, I don't know what the relationship was. I get the feeling they weren't affiliated, but they may have been, because Ray Eldon in 1931, ended up in 1932. He sued Sid Pollock and stopped him from using the name Cuban House of David. But Colored House of David kept on going. So there probably was a relationship, and I'm just not sure what it was. Could have been a booking relationship that has something to do with Ray Eldon.
Right. and Whitty too, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were quite a few years that like there's a poster right there, white House of David versus colored House of David in basketball. And I know, I think in the early 30s, maybe mid 30s, Phil, if you know, when the House of David went down to Cuba and recruited a bunch of Cuban players to create a colored House of David team. I think that was Lewis Murphy, wasn't it? Do you know?
Well, I knew, matter of fact, I knew Lewis Murphy. Lewis Murphy came from my hometown. If we're talking about the same guy, was this a ball player? No, this got to be a different guy. Got to be a different guy. But
yeah, he was a promoter.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that history there.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, Lewis Murphy had teams. He had franchise teams from the House of David year after year, really successful ones, along with Ray Doan and Whitty. But then the House of David had to sue Lewis Murphy to stop using the name back in the late 30s because he quit paying their franchise fee, and they got a New York court injunction against Murphy. But he kept doing it. They couldn't catch him. They couldn't catch up with him quick enough.
And were there others too who kind of adopted the whole? They adopted it as a shtick. They wore beards and they called themselves the House of David. And was it kind of running rampant that there were all these other unlicensed imitators, or was it that one feud that you just mentioned?
No, there were many teams back. You asked Don about them recruiting teams, players, and by 19 when they did the lighting agreement with the Monarchs, I have newspaper clippings from 31, 32, 33, where they had the largest crowds ever in the history of all these cities when the House of David showed up with their lights to play these teams across America. And what that did was created this gigantic attention to the House of David that they couldn't fill. And so they went out and recruited what they called ringers. Lloyd called them the superstar players, where they would go to your town, and if your team had a really powerful pitcher catcher duo or a home run hitter, they would go back 3 weeks later with a couple of their managers, find these guys and offer them 3 times the money to start growing their whiskers and come on with the House of David. And soon after, by the late 1930s, they had 5 and 6 teams traveling the country and playing under all kinds of different managers, not directly related to the House of David, but calling themselves House of David. But then there were what they call the imposter teams, which were teams that guys grew their whiskers and their hair long, and they had House of David on their jersey, but they weren't anything to do with House of David. So that's when they had I think it was a New York Supreme Court ruled that you can't play baseball just because you have whiskers and call yourself House of David. So, they got this giant court injunction, but Lloyd said, Chris, the only thing was that paper, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on because of the lack of the speed of communication and technology back then. They would find out a week or 2 or a month after the fact that these people traveled the country as imposter teams. And I think that's also an important piece of House of David baseball history. I don't care if they were the real team or not, they were still a part of the story. So,
well, the fact that they wanted to imitate the House of David gave the House of David so much more press.
Absolutely.
And I would just like to add, Nathan, to the people that are tuned in, if they're in Southwest Michigan and they're a baseball fan, they should take in the House of David Museum, and they should plan some time there. It is the most fascinating place you'll probably ever visit.
Definitely. And before we have another question in the chat, but first let me ask one more question about the site where you are, Chris, and that is, I guess you're near or somewhat near the site of the Eden Springs Amusement Park, which for years lay in ruins, but now I guess there's some movement to try to restore some of it, some of the old roundhouse where the trains went through, and some of the other buildings. A few of them appear to be salvageable. Again, it's an amazing part of the story because you have this, again, relatively cloistered religious community that has an amusement park with zoos and concerts and baseball. That you don't see that every day. So it's right now there might not be a whole lot to see at that particular site, but is that a correct understanding that it's in the process of potentially having a comeback?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, back, that was one of my dreams forever because it had been closed for about 40 years. And I had just begged the House of David folks to let that thing get open again, and they were against it forever. Well, finally, they agreed to sell the amusement park part, which is about 50 acres. And myself and two other guys bought that back in 2009. And within a couple of years, that was turned over to a 501c3 not-for-profit group, and it's ran now by, they call it the Eden Springs Park. The baseball field is still there, which has the right field wall still in place. And you got to understand that's, Babe Ruth played on that field. Satchel Paige probably played there, along with, years and years of House of David people. And a lot of baseball historians called it, they call it like a part of the Field of Dreams. It's very powerful. They know where home plate was at, and their little miniature steam engine trains are running again. The park is slowly getting put back together, even though, a lot of it's gone. Just Mother Nature took it after 4 decades of abandonment. But it's a very cool experience, even in the rough right now. So it's very cool.
A question in the chat from LJ Barrett, who compliments the discussion. And we haven't talked a lot about the religious background of the House of David community. And we don't maybe want to get too deep in the weeds. I do feel we would be remiss if we didn't say that Benjamin Purnell, who was portrayed in the Ken Burns clip, the founder of the community, early manager of the team, was embroiled in a very distressing scandal of sexual abuse of minors, which led to a big fraction within the community back in the 20s. And so the question from LJ Barrett is, what was the denomination of the House of David, and does it exist in any way today? My understanding is there are a few members of the community, but Chris, tell us a little bit about that. And then my larger question is, they're often referred to as a cult. And I saw a quote from you when you gave an interview and you said, well, they were a cult, but they were a good cult. And so unwrap that a little bit. What do we make of this religious community and the role that religion played in its identity? But first, LJ's question: what was their denomination, and do they still exist?
Okay, yeah, it's the House of David was the name of their religion, just like the Shakers, the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Oneida. They were, a form of Christianity, American-based. Started in 1903. They believed in God and Jesus, but they held Benjamin as a very high pillar, like John Smith of the Mormon type thing. He preached that if you live this celibate, vegetarian, communal Christian lifestyle, that you would live forever. And the other part of your question is they're all dead. So that didn't work so good. But there are a couple younger guys that I introduced there about 12, 13 years ago that still oversee the big mansions that they have, which have been fully restored. They're all private at the moment. But the faith doesn't really live on anymore. The House of David original people are all gone. Matter of fact, the last one died last year. So.
And to wrap up the question about the different teams that the House of David had, another question from Gary about did the House of David have an official B team? So Don, your book talks about how the House of David, I guess in the 20s, maybe 30s, had a junior team, a home team, and a travel team. And throughout they also had a women's team. And then we've talked about how in this period where there were imitators, some licensed, some not. So I'm sure the question gets complicated there, but what's the answer to this question? Was there an official or were there official B teams? Does that get back to this question of who was licensed?
I guess the closest you could come to a B team would be the junior team. They're the younger guys and they're the ones that are going to be coming up. So that would be probably the B team. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Again, as we've said, once you get into this period where there's different teams calling themselves that, I'm sure it gets impossible to really unravel completely.
Yeah, then they had a home team and they had a touring team, the traveling team. And my understanding was at some point they had an Eastern team and a Western team. So they had two teams on the road.
Right.
Good. Thanks to all of you for your questions. I have one more question that I want to ask each panelist to answer. And that is, and you've each already answered it, I think, or have begun to, but let me ask it this way. What is or what should be the legacy of this team? What was their historical significance? Why, when Ken Burns told the story of baseball, did he say you can't have a documentary about baseball without including this team? What was the historical significance to baseball of the House of David? Don, can you start?
Well, I think it all evolves around their love of the game. And I think their major contribution and their benefit to baseball, in my opinion, is they played in small towns across America. And when they came to town, the schools and places of business would close so the townspeople could be entertained by these charismatic players. And it greatly enhanced the love and the game of baseball for the townspeople and for the people playing it, which they loved the game. And even the people that couldn't attend the game, the people that did, they'd go back home or to work and whatever, and they'd talk about, this, and people just fell in love with it. The novelty, the beards and the long hair drew the crowds, and the skill of the players just lasted in the townspeople's memories.
Great, thank you. Chris, how would you summarize, if you could, the significance to history of this team?
It's gigantic. Everything that Don said. Here's a group of religious guys from Benton Harbor, Michigan, that had long hair and beards, and they set out to have some fun. And they set and broke every record there was in baseball back in their day, and they just loved baseball. They wore these heavy wool uniforms with no air conditioning, playing 3 games a day, and going across dirt roads for 1,000 miles, where they'd have to pick the bus up out of a muddy hole and get it off to where it gained traction again, and go 3-4 days with no shower. And they just loved it. They loved it. They couldn't stand each other in the bus because it stinked so bad, but that long hair and beards and no shower for a few days got a little right. But they definitely set the world on fire in baseball. They loved the Negro leagues. They loved playing with the black guys that they were so entertained by, that they felt were better than the major leagues. They swore that they were better than most all major league teams. And they couldn't get enough of it. And and Lloyd, when he was 95 years old, we interviewed him and said, Lloyd, if you could say anything, what would you say was your favorite thing in life? And he said, just getting out and playing ball. Getting out and playing ball. That was it.
Phil, how would you articulate the historical significance of the House of David?
Well, it's an excellent story, first of all. And I do want to say on Chris's collection, before I answer that question, that is an amazing collection. And it is definitely on my bucket list to get there. So I would encourage anyone, if you love baseball, that's a place you ought to go. And uh, to answer that question, I think about, some of the humorous things that happened to the House of David on the road. I remember reading a story that they pulled into some town, and they stopped in front of the barber shop, and they all got out of the car. And I guess the barber was looking out the window. He thought he had a big day for business. And they look in the window, then they get back in the car and drive off. Probably sounds like dry humor, but it was pretty good stuff back in the 1930s. But they loved the game and the sacrifices they made. You think Ray O'Donnell. Ray O'Donnell was a master booking agent, and he would start his team in Mineral Springs, Texas in the 30s, and they're going to play to October 1st. They got an off day if it rained. Sometimes they would play 2 games in a night. I ran across one time a game they played in, it was up in Minnesota, St. Cloud, Minnesota. And because they couldn't play on Sunday after 6, they waited till midnight and started the game at midnight, 12:01, and they played to about 3 in the morning.
Wow.
And people came. So they loved this game, and they really paid a supreme price to play this game. And I think that what Ken Burns said, I understand, but I think it's up to all of us to recognize these men who made this game of baseball last for all of us to be able to enjoy. And every time a big leaguer takes the field, he doesn't know what came before him, but teams like the House of David or the Negro Leagues, these guys were outside of the baseball quote establishment, but they made a tremendous contribution and they paid a tremendous price. And so I think the House of David, in my estimation, along with the Kansas City Monarchs, light baseball and the night baseball, saved baseball in the Depression.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a major statement and major significance. Phil, before we let you go, we want to make sure to plug your book, The Dizzy and Daffy Dean Barnstorming Tour, Race, Media, and America's National Pastime, published in 2019. It's high on my to-read list. Will the House of David make an appearance at any point in that book? And even if not, I get the sense that the themes are very closely connected to what we've been discussing tonight.
Well, they don't actually make an appearance, but there are some players who they became Dizzy Dean's All-Stars, and they were local players. And then Ray O'Donnell, who was promoting the tour, saw them, and he signed them up for the House of David in 1935. So they are part of it. And a lot of people don't know this, but originally the tour was going to be Dizzy Dean against the House of David. And then later on, they changed it and made it against black baseball teams, and the House of David didn't get a chance to participate. So the House of David was a part of the planning, but they weren't there in the end. So a lot of people don't know that. So just simply great history.
Absolutely. One last question. I want to make sure we get all the questions that are posted here. Another question from LJ. Did the House of David players do any proselytizing before or after the games in the towns they visited? How overt or direct was their religious pitch, if there was any? Don or Chris?
Yes, they did. I think it was Ray Doan that used to hand out cards, postcards, and also religious material. So they did do some proselytizing.
Yeah, they would pass out flyers in the bleachers and things like that. So, but they tried not to go too deep into the religion to mix it with baseball, but they definitely left their trail behind.
Okay, good.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank all of you who logged on tonight. It's been a really enjoyable discussion, and I'm glad so many of you could share it with us. And I want to really thank our 3 speakers tonight, Don Gittersanke, Chris Siriano, and Phil Dixon. Each of you have such a wealth of knowledge on this topic and many others, and we're very generous to share your time with us. So thank you, each of you, for joining us tonight and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you also, Nathan.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. I feel honored to be amongst you guys.
And once again, buy Phil's book on Dizzy and Daffy Dean. Go to Chris's museum. The link is in the chat. And buy Don's book, Baseball's Bearded Boys, which has now been reprinted. You can email me about that. And once again, stay tuned. Next month, we have a lot of big baseball author book talks coming your way to kick off the new baseball season. So log on to the website, follow that, and we will see you then. Thanks, everyone.